Evening, everyone. And thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Before we begin our presentation, I would like to introduce our company and our guest speaker. My name is Claudia Gotti for ADHD Online. ADHD Online is a comprehensive platform that allows you to receive a formal evaluation and treatment for ADHD from our network of licensed psychologists and physicians from the comfort of your home. We make ADHD diagnosis and treatment accessible and affordable through our network of board of certified psychologists and physicians through our leading edge technology. And we want to offer our community our ADHD online webinars. And these are a free resource that covers important popular ADHD related topics with simple goals to improve awareness and to empower our community to live their best lives. Our ADHD experts host our webinars. Some of our presenters share their personal experience and how they have succeeded and overcome ADHD life struggles. All these webinars are live and we have replays on Facebook and our website. And we will have a Q&A segment for attendees to ask questions at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker. We're very, very excited to have Jill Castle with us tonight. Jill is one of the nation's premier childhood nutrition experts, known as a paradigm shifter who blends current research, practical application, and common sense. Jill inspires audiences to think differently about feeding kids. A sought-after speaker, advisor, and media contributor, Jill has inspired TEDx and a range of nutrition, medical, and government and parent audiences. Jill serves on the board of advisors of Parents Magazine and is the nutrition advisor to a handful of privately held child nutrition companies. And she is a creator of the nourishedchild.com, a parent nutrition education website, and author of the best books, Eat Like a Champion, Try New Food, The Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solids, and the co-author of Fearless Feeding. She pens the Nourished Child blog and interviews experts on her podcast of the same name. So without further ado, I present to you Jill Castle and the power and promise of good nutrition for kids. Thank you so much, Jill.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you for that nice introduction. And it's wonderful to be here tonight with the ADHD online community. I'm going to share with you tonight really some information that about nutrition and food for children with ADHD. So let's get to it. So the highlights of what I'll discuss tonight include some information around growth and development in children with ADHD, some of the nutrients that are of concern, what it means to have a balanced diet, and how to fill those nutrient gaps that can exist for children with ADHD. We'll talk a little bit about food parenting, and I'll hint a little bit about some of the common challenges that we see with ADHD in regards to food and the diet. We'll also talk about some of the additives in foods that you'll want to watch out for, and what it means to be on a special diet with ADHD. I want to give you somewhat of a broad reaching overview of nutrition, nutrition and food for ADHD. So ADHD is complicated. If you have a child with ADHD, you know this. Food and feeding can be one of those daily struggles that you're dealing with. If you have a child that does not eat well, that can be an additional stressor. But food and nutrition are key aspects of the management of ADHD. A lot of times parents will ask me if a special diet or if nutrition can cure ADHD. There's absolutely no research to date that shows us that it can. However, what I hope that you will learn tonight is that it is a complementary approach. It is additive. It helps children. It helps them grow. It helps them develop. It helps them feel better, and it helps them function better. So the goals for kids with ADHD and for all kids really is that they over the years have a normal weight gain and normal growth. And we see this on their growth charts. So if you've taken your child to the pediatrician and they get weighed and measured every year, you always have an opportunity to look at that growth chart with your pediatrician, and you can see how your child is growing. You can actually see how they are tracking on the weight curve, on the height curve, and how their body weight is tracking in relation to their height growth. Another goal we have for children, again, for all children, is to not have any nutrient deficiencies. We know that if nutrient deficiencies exist, that can impair the health and growth and development of a child. And in children with ADHD, it can impair their functioning. We also have a goal of helping children be able to regulate their appetite. And so what I mean by that is they recognize when they're hungry, they recognize when they're satisfied or even when they're full, and their actions around eating reflect that knowledge within themselves. We also, for children with ADHD, we want to minimize erratic eating as much as possible. So when we talk about growth, I want to break it down into weight status and height status and give you what we know about what the research is telling us. And we know that children with ADHD can be underweight. And I think a lot of people automatically think underweight is the primary status for children with ADHD, but that's not the case. Actually, most children are normal weight. They weigh in at a normal body weight. They look like they're growing great on the growth charts, but some children will be underweight and even some children will be overweight. And that actually is a growing segment of weight status in children with ADHD across the board. When we're talking about height status, we know that in some children, we're seeing height deficits, particularly when children are on ADHD medication. And that seems to be related to the dopaminergic effect on growth hormone. So growth hormone secretion is affected by medication. And what the research studies are telling us is that when children go off their medications, they are able to recuperate that stagnation in their height growth. As parents and as a professional who has worked with children with ADHD, we want to monitor children's growth. It is the first sign that things are getting off track, in addition to their diet, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But we want to look at those growth charts and be really familiar with them and familiar with our kids' growth, their weight gain and their height growth. We know that if we see a variance in the growth chart, so let's just say, for example, your child is tracking along the 25th percentile for weight. And if we see a variance or a deviation of 2 growth percentiles, meaning your child falls off 2 growth percentiles or increases 2 growth percentiles, that is what we call a cause for concern and perhaps a need for intervention. So this is where the growth charts can really help you. They can alert you that something's going on. So if you go in one year and your child's growing great on the 25th percentile, and you go back the next year and your child's weight has dropped to the 15th percentile or the 10th percentile or all the way down to the 5th percentile, that can be a red flag that your child isn't getting enough nutrition. The scientific recommendations, when we look at the literature, is recommending that children with ADHD have a growth status checked every 6 months. So that's not the recommendation for children without ADHD. The recommendation for them is every 12 months. But because we know there's so much going on with eating and appetite and medication interactions, of which I'll get into next, we know that we want to be watching kids with ADHD a little bit more closely. We also want to be checking in on their appetite. So your pediatrician or your care team should be asking you, how's your child's appetite? What are you noticing? Are they eating 3 meals? Are they having snacks? What are the eating patterns like? This is something that should be part of your child's routine care. Good growth, so that normal growing along the growth chart, following your growth channels, it is dependent on good nutrition and eating enough food, which makes a lot of sense, but I just wanted to make sure we made that point. So if good growth is dependent on good nutrition, why are children having problems with their growth? And that's because there are many obstacles that are standing in the way. Eating can be very challenging for a child with ADHD. There can be sensory interference. There can be medication interference with appetite. Children can have tummy aches. They can have sleeping problems, headaches, constipation, and all of this can lead to a poor appetite. And when a child has a poor appetite, they are most likely going to be a poor eater. So when we talk about, what is the best diet for children with ADHD, and I will get into what that looks like because we're going to get a little bit more granular with nutrients and additives in the diet. But if we look at, what is an ideal balanced diet for a child, we're looking at food groups and we're looking at food variety and we're looking at food balance. So just as a recap, the food groups include foods from the protein group, foods from the whole grain group, the fruit group, the vegetable group, and the dairy group. And if your child isn't a dairy person, we want to see your child drinking or eating a non-dairy fortified substitute. And this little icon, this little graphic that I have here is a representation of sort of the flexibility that can happen with a balanced diet. And I call it the 90-10 rule. So 90% of what a child is eating on a day-to-day basis is coming from those nourishing food groups, coming from the protein group, the grain group, the fruit, vegetable, dairy group. Healthy fats are also part of what that 90% of the day in, day out diet looks like. 10% of the diet can come from fun foods. And I call these fun foods mostly because children relate to that terminology, but it's really sweets and treats, things like cookies and cakes and ice cream and candy and sugary beverages like lemonade and soda and sweet tea. We can have these in our diet and children can enjoy these in their diet, but you can see where the balance that we want to strike is. It's a small amount of the diet. It's 1 or 2 fun foods per day on average. So that's what an ideal balanced diet for every child should really look like. But when we look at children with ADHD, the reality is very different. It's more of an inadequate diet. And this is not personal to your child. I'm speaking on sort of broad strokes, what we see across the board. And there will always be children who don't fit this bill, who are great eaters and getting all the nutrition that they need. But more often than not, what we see is children who aren't getting enough protein in their diet, or they're not getting whole grains. They're getting all white or refined grains in their diet. They're not getting enough fruit. They might not be getting any vegetables, and they have a lot of sweets and treats in their diet. So why is this? Why is the balance of the diet off so much? Why are children not getting what they need? Well, there are some underlying reasons, and I want to walk you through some of these. One is medication interactions. We know that the research is telling us that 60% of children on medications for ADHD experience a lack of appetite. That's a big percentage of children. 40% experience tummy aches and 20% experience headaches. Well, all of that can kill your appetite at one point or another. We know that certain medications, because I'm sure you're all wondering, well, what is the medication that my child takes, what is it doing? Well, we know that the research is telling us that children who are on methylphenidate or amphetamines, they are experiencing that lack of appetite or any kind of tummy ache, headache. They're experiencing that 30% of the time. And kids on Strattera or Intuitive are experiencing these symptoms 15% of the time. We also know that the research is telling us that higher medication doses increase the reports of side effects. That makes sense, right? We also know that long-acting products may prolong side effects, but may reduce the severity of the side effects. So that basically means your child could have a lack of appetite for a long time, but that lack of appetite may not be as severe as some of the more shorter acting medications. Again, my advice is if you notice that your child's medications are impacting his appetite, his giving him headaches or tummy aches, that is reason to talk to your physician about the medication type and the medication dosage, particularly if it's interfering with your child's ability to eat, gain weight, and grow normally. Another reason why children's diets are so off balance and perhaps even inadequate is because there may be some food sensory or food aversion characteristics or complications underlying everything. So we know that kids with ADHD and autism, kids on the autism spectrum, do experience a higher rate of sensory interference or food aversion. They have more sensitivities around things like texture of food or the smell of food, the way it looks, or the flavor. So some of the things that I've seen over the years are that, children are very turned off by mushy, wet foods and really gravitate towards crunchy and crisp foods. They might be offended by the odor of things like vegetables or eggs or fish. And that's related to the chemical within those foods that sends off that odorous smell. Also, we know that children who have food aversion or seem to be more sensitive to the sensory aspects or characteristics of food are a little bit more hypersensitive to flavors of bitter and sour, and can be more drawn to the flavors of sweet and salty. So that's sort of can be very much complicating the foods that a child may want to eat or may be a lion's share of their diet. We know that children who have food aversion or sensory interference or sensitivities are at increased risk for growth delay and unhealthy weight gain. So both ends of the spectrum, they can be underweight and not growing well, or they can be overweight and putting on unhealthy weight. Again, it relates back to we know the foods they don't like, but what are the foods they are gravitating to and are eating day in and day out? Constipation is another complication that can be an underlying reason as to why a child may not be eating very well. And we know the primary reason for constipation is a low fiber diet. So a diet that does not have enough whole grains, vegetables, fruits, beans, nuts, seeds, all of those foods that provide fiber. Also, it might be related to not getting enough fluids during the day. A lot of kids can walk around just sort of barely meeting their fluid guidelines or their fluid goals for the day. And if your child is sort of riding low on food and riding low on hydration status, so combine low fiber and dehydration, and it's a recipe for constipation. We know there is some good evidence and research going on about the use of probiotics in children with ADHD and the use of fermented foods. Fermented foods and probiotics both encourage a healthy gut microbiome in children. It's providing that healthy fuel for the gut to be able to process foods and metabolize foods that come through more easily. We know also that research is telling us that kids with ADHD tend to have lower gut microbes or an unhealthy gut microbiome. So it's something to pay attention to, not only just if your child is constipated, but just for the overall health of your child. Paying attention to, probiotic foods like yogurt with live cultures, or incorporating more fermented foods like um, pickles or kefir. All of those foods can be very helpful to children. Let's get a little bit more granular and talk about the common nutrient deficiencies that we see in kids with ADHD. What we know about a nutrient deficiency is that it can impair the functioning of your child. And that can be also a nutrient deficiency can impair the medication effectiveness. There's several studies that say when there is a nutrient deficiency, medications don't work as well. We know that nutrient deficiencies can interfere with sleep, well-being, obviously, and then the immune response. A depleted nutritional status is always tied to reduced immune status. So iron is a big one. There's a lot of research on iron and ADHD in children. What iron does is it provides the central nervous system with structure, particularly in the early years where you're building you're born with the central nervous system, but it grows in infancy and it multiplies and gets bigger. And iron is very much an important component of that. Iron also oxygenates the blood. And basically carries oxygen to the cells. I always like to tell kids when I'm working with them that oxygen helps the cells breathe. So our iron helps the cells breathe because it's bringing oxygen to the cells. And iron's also involved in neurotransmission. So that's the communication between the neurons in the brain, the pathways, that information highway in the brain is dependent on iron status. We know that a deficiency of iron is going to impair cognitive development in very young children. We know in children with ADHD, there's some documentation around restless leg syndrome, that twitchy, itchy feeling that children can get sometimes and they just can't sit still. That can be related to a deficiency in iron. Irritability, fatigue, of course, if you're iron deficient, that can cause incredible fatigue. And it's also tied to inattentiveness in children with ADHD. The treatment for an iron deficiency, if it is a documented iron deficiency, meaning you've gone to the doctor, you've had a ferritin level drawn and it is low, the treatment is an iron supplement. We want to get those iron levels up back to a normal level as fast as we can. And iron-rich foods, while they are wonderful and are part of the treatment plan, they take a while to get the iron recuperated back up to normal levels. So we want to treat a deficiency that's been documented while also encouraging iron-rich foods. There's some interesting evidence around iron in the blood, looking like it is at normal levels. But there are researchers out there that propose that the iron content in the brain is not reflected in the blood, and that you can have a deficiency state whereby the brain cells aren't getting the iron that it needs, or the brain storage sites are low, and you're not going to see that in the blood draw. So iron is really a very interesting player in ADHD. And it's something worth talking to your primary care provider about in terms of just keeping an eye on iron status. Again, if you know that your child doesn't eat a lot of protein sources, doesn't like meat, for example, may not be eating dark greens, spinach, and kale, for example, or raisins and molasses, or other iron-rich foods, which there are a lot of. But if you know your child is not eating those foods, then I would be curious about iron, and it would be a nutrient that I would want my client to be keeping track of and keeping an eye on. So some practical tips for what you can do to make sure your child's getting enough iron in his day-to-day diet. focus on the heme iron. Heme iron comes from animals. It is highly absorbable in the human body, more so than plant-based iron. I think, you know, if you can get iron in plant-based foods as well, you just need a little bit of a helper, and that's usually vitamin C, which you can find in citrus fruits, for example, or tomatoes. But you want to make sure you're focused on iron-rich foods, at least both kinds of foods. But if you're finding that your child is not eating animal-based iron sources, then you definitely want to be watching iron content, checking his or her iron levels, and making sure that when he does eat those plant sources of iron, like dark green leafy vegetables, that that's getting partnered with a vitamin C source. You can get a blood test if you're in doubt about your child's iron status. If you feel like, we haven't had an iron test in a while, my child has sleeping problems, not a good sleeper, might be worth a test. Preteen and teen girls are at high risk for an iron deficiency because, of course, they may start their periods, and that is a loss of iron that is ongoing on a monthly basis. So we want to make sure we have an extra third eye on the preteen and teen girl. And we also want to know and pay attention to the fact that calcium can interfere with iron absorption. So that glass of milk with a steak, that calcium from the milk can very much interfere with the iron absorption of the steak. So the other thing that the research does tell us is, and this is an important part, if your child is not deficient in iron, supplements aren't going to make things better. What the research tells us about iron is that when children are deficient, they are not, they have poor iron intake, poor iron status. Those are the kids where an iron supplementation really does help. And it can really help them improve their overall functioning and feeling better as well, feeling more energetic. The other nutrient is zinc, and we know zinc is involved in brain development. Again, that transmission of information, communication between brain cells, and enzyme creation. We know also that deficiency of zinc can incur poor growth and poor appetite. Also inattentiveness in children with ADHD, but not impulsivity or hyperactivity. So the research tells us that low zinc in the diet or a zinc deficiency is more aligned with inattentiveness than anything else when we talk about children with ADHD. How do you encourage more zinc in the diet? Again, meat, red meat, poultry, they are all rich sources of zinc. Oysters, if your child likes oysters, I've got one that loves oysters. That's probably the richest source of zinc you can offer in terms of a food. Fish, other fish, poultry, fortified cereals. So I think we sometimes forget about cold cereals that are fortified. They're fortified with iron, they're fortified with zinc, folic acid, calcium, vitamin D. Cold cereal can be a great source of nutrition, particularly for a child who may not have a great, varied diet. Beans, whole grains, nuts, all of those are good sources of zinc. And of course, if you find that your child is deficient in zinc, you would want to treat that. Blood tests aren't the most reliable source or reliable way to measure zinc, but a good diet assessment from a dietitian or a nutrition professional can flag low zinc in the diet. And over time, again, that can accumulate that deficiency state. We do want to treat a deficiency of zinc, and you may see symptom improvement related to that. Again, oysters, red meat, poultry, beans, cereals are all good sources of zinc. And if you have a vegetarian in your family, just know that vegetarians are at higher risk for a zinc deficiency and for an iron deficiency because they're eliminating animal foods like meats. And those are some of the richest sources of iron and zinc. Magnesium is another nutrient. What it does is it signals the nerves, it calms nerves and muscles, encourages blood flow throughout the body and the brain. and helps us process the nutrients in food. So it helps us sort of metabolize those foods and nutrients. A deficiency in magnesium in a child with ADHD is linked to hyperactivity, inattentiveness, or distractibility. Again, treatment is focusing on those magnesium-rich foods like fortified breakfast cereals, nuts, spinach, soy milk, beans, bread, avocado, yogurt, and banana. And there is evidence that shows that supplementation, like in a multivitamin, which is what you would typically do with magnesium, or if you are diagnosed with a magnesium deficiency, you might supplement that as a single nutrient. Supplements do show a small benefit in children with ADHD. Again, any kind of supplementation that you might want to do with your child really should be done in conjunction with your healthcare provider, because children are growing and developing and changing a lot. Their bodies are different sizes at different ages, and the dosing of these micronutrients is very important to pay attention to. You don't want to overdose because some vitamins are toxic, and you don't want to underdose either. You want to get right on the mark. So working with your health care professional can really help you sort of tailor make a supplement plan if your child needs it. Again, blood tests aren't reliable. Most magnesium in the body is in the bones and in the cells, so we can't really measure that. What we see in the blood is just a small percentage of what we have in our whole body. But again, I can do a diet recall and tell somebody if they have low magnesium in their diet based on looking at those food groups. Again, magnesium you find in whole grains and in some of the protein foods. And if you have a kid that's not eating any protein foods or any whole grains or eats very little, those facts raise red flags about sufficiency in the diet. Basically, to find foods with magnesium, target foods with fiber in them. And an overall deficiency in magnesium is very rare. However, what the research tells us is that in kids with ADHD, those are the kids that tend to be more susceptible at low magnesium in the diet. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, EPA and DHA, eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid. What these do, EPA increases blood flow in the brain. So that makes a lot of sense, right? If the brain is working and learning and trying to remember things, we need good blood flow going on up there. And DHA is involved in nerve cell function. And in the early years of life during infancy, it's highly tied to brain development and the development of the retina. So that part of the eye that helps you see. A deficiency in EPA is associated with poor attention, memory, hyperactivity, and impulsiveness. And a deficiency in DHA is associated with poor literacy. So having a difficult time learning how to read can be a red flag for that. We like to see, obviously, food sources of DHA and EPA in children's diets, but I can tell you all children, regardless of whether there is an ADHD diagnosis or not, all children have a really hard time meeting the recommendations for EPA and DHA in their daily diet. You'll find these nutrients in nuts, fatty fish, canola oil, safflower oil, salmon. A daily supplement for all children and children with ADHD is considered safe as long as it's dosed according to body weight. Practical tips about incorporating more of these PUFAs and MUFAs into your child's diet. Focus on more plant-based fats like avocado, plant oils like safflower or sunflower oil, olive oil, nuts and fish. Those are those healthy fat foods. They are good for all of us. We know that omega-3 fats, EPA and DHA, are good for our heart, good for our brains. We know that the literature, the research tells us that omega-3s have shown a small effect, a small beneficial effect. But the consensus is that there are so many health benefits to omega-3 fatty acids that when they are dosed for your child's body size and age, they can be of benefit. So for ADHD, the research also goes on, the latest research rather, is showing that a combination of EPA and DHA with GLA, gamma linolenic acid, that combination seems to be most effective for children with ADHD. Fiber, I mentioned this earlier with constipation. You know that fiber acts as like a broom that can sweep out the colon, the gastrointestinal tract, get rid of all the stool, which is, you know, the byproduct of digestion and metabolism of food. We know that foods in that are high in fiber are fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and beans. A deficiency, as I mentioned earlier, can cause constipation or even just irregularity with bowel movements. And again, getting more fiber into the diet is an important aspect for all children. You can incorporate natural fiber foods from those food groups I just mentioned. You want to make sure you always give plenty of fluids, and start introducing, if you haven't already, your child to some fermented foods like kefir and yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi. Again, remembering that those bitter flavors for children who might have some sensory component to their eating can be a challenge. But in order to have children be exposed and experience new foods, we have to keep presenting them to them in a positive way. You can also consider a child-based probiotic that contains different strains of bacteria. So it is generally accepted that probiotics for children are okay. They're not harmful. They're harmless. They're not necessarily a cure-all for constipation. In fact, there's very little research on probiotics and as a cure for constipation. However, again, we know that it helps build a healthy gut microbiome, and there's quite a bit of research in children. And believe it or not, a lot of that research is done in premature babies and in infants. So it's generally considered safe in children, as long as you're not hyperdosing or megadosing it. But find a child strain. The ones I like are Culturelle, and Floristore Kids is another good one that you can incorporate in your child's day-to-day routine. So supplementation is a good idea when a deficiency exists, and it's something you want to do with your healthcare provider. But mega vitamin use is unproven scientifically in children and can be quite dangerous. So we don't want to overdose on vitamins, and we want to make sure that we are finding multivitamins or single-based vitamins that are pure, that we know are what they say they are, and that have been checked by a third party to make sure that no contaminants are in there. So again, working with your healthcare provider can really help you find just the right supplement for your child. We know that supplementation of a deficiency can improve ADHD symptoms. It can increase the effectiveness of the medications that your child is taking for ADHD. But again, we want to make sure that your child is getting the right amount and the right nutrients because we want it to work for them. Other components of the diet that are worthy of being mentioned, because a lot of families have questions about extra sugar or too much sugar in their child's diet, artificial food dyes, and additives. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on that and give you some overview of that. So refined sugar, what does the research tell us? The research tells us that some kids can be sensitive to added sugar, too much sugar in their diet, meaning that they are more aggressive and more hyperactive as a result of eating a bunch of sugar. Sugary foods, it is not a global statement to say that all children are sensitive to sugar. They're just not. There's no research that supports that. But there is research that says some kids could be. And so it's important to know that and be curious about your own child. Um, what is also interesting is that sugary foods tend to have other food additives like artificial food colors in them. And we'll talk about that in the next few slides. What's really going on with added sugar or refined sugar? Oftentimes what's happening is that once a child eats a lot of sugar, like say they're at a party and they eat a bunch of sugary food, their blood sugar spikes up and then it plummets quickly in a short amount of time afterwards. And that plummet, researchers feel, is what is responsible for that aggressiveness in kids who are sensitive to sugar. Sugar, too much sugar, and that plummet from the blood sugar can also stimulate epinephrine, which can cause hyperactivity. So what can we do? I mean, for all children, we don't want children to have excessive amounts of sugar and sweet foods in their diet. Remember that 90-10 graphic I showed you, 10%. That means 1 or 2 sweet types of foods a day in normal portions. And that's really where we want to target. So again, I always invite parents to just sort of take an objective look at their child's diet and step back and say, my kid is having, sweets 4, 5, 6 times a day. Well, if that's where your child's at, try to get it down to 5 times. Work on that for a little bit. Then try and get it down to 4 a day or 3 a day. Gradually get your child scaled back to a more reasonable balance in their diet. Additives. So what do we know about additives? Well, the research tells us that some children, just like with sugar, appear to be sensitive to things like MSG, aspartame, which is a sugar substitute, nitrites and nitrates, and sodium benzoate, which is a preservative. What's really going on here is that we don't have a lot of research here. Most of the research or the studies that are out there are parent report based or anecdotal. That doesn't mean that there's not an issue. That doesn't mean that your child is not sensitive. It just means that we don't have any hardcore science that's saying, yeah, we're seeing a big trend here with all children with ADHD. So what I usually tell my clients is to get curious, to trial, taking the additives or the preservatives out of the diet for 1 or 2 weeks and see if you notice a change in your child's behavior. If you feel like every time you go to the Chinese restaurant, your child is bouncing off the walls, he might be sensitive to MSG. And so you might need to take a break from that Chinese restaurant or ask for them to not put MSG in your dish. So that's really what you want to do is really try to take those items out of your child's diet for a week or two, a short experimental period, and see if you notice a significant change in your child's behavior. Food dyes. 8% of children in the United States 8% of children with ADHD in the United States respond to artificial food colors. I suspect that's higher. The European Union studies show significant hyperactivity related to artificial food colors. We're not on the same path. We're not on the same playing field here when it comes to artificial food colors. Our data is not reflective of what they're seeing over in Europe. And as a result, in Europe, there are food label warnings on any foods with artificial food colors, and they've eliminated many of them in children's food products. Here, however, there are 9 different artificial food colors that are allowed in the United States. I've put them over here on the left-hand side of the slides. Red number 40, yellow number 5, and yellow number 6 are the 3 most common. But there's also brilliant blue number 1, blue number 2, green number 3, and red number 3. So synthetic food dyes can act on the neurological system causing hyperactivity in sensitive kids. Again, that's really sort of the underpinning of what is going on. And again, these food dyes are in a lot of sugary sweetened beverages, candy, and other kid foods that children are eating. And if you feel like your child is sensitive to artificial food colors, you can take a little elimination diet period of time and get them out of your child's diet for a week or two and see if you notice a change in behavior. Many parents tell me they do. So here are some examples. As I mentioned, red number 40, yellow number 5, and yellow number 6 are the most common ones in the United States, particularly in children's foods. But you can see colored cereal, mac and cheese, slushies, Gatorades, sports drinks that are of different colors, candy, Pop-Tarts. There are even artificial colors in marshmallows, believe it or not. They're used quite a bit in foods. And so again, if you suspect your child is sensitive to artificial food dyes, then take a break. Take a structured break from them. Map out a week or two where you just don't have those foods in your child's diet, and really take note and notice, journal even, the differences in behavior that you see. If you don't see any change in behavior, your child probably isn't sensitive. But if you do, your child probably is, and it's something you want to keep out of the diet. A lot of times parents wonder about special diets for kids with ADHD, and I just wanted to go over a couple. I'm not a proponent or a negative of them. I just want you to understand what the different diets are and what their purpose is. I'm not promoting anything but more knowledge for you so that you have a better base to parent from when it comes to food and nutrients. Elimination diets are diets that are helpful for kids with food sensitivities. So allergic type reactions, eczema, for example, or when parents are just really suspicious that there's something in the diet that is bothering their child and they can't put their finger on it. So an elimination diet really takes some of those classic food allergens out of the diet for a short period of time so that you can evaluate what food is the culprit. So we usually take out dairy, wheat, nuts, eggs, chocolate, and citrus for 2 to 3 weeks, and then we reintroduce them one at a time. Obviously, this is a short-term experimental diet. We don't want kids on elimination diets for years and years and years because they can be very restrictive and they can cause nutrient deficiencies and they can cause growth failure. So this is something you do with a professional, and it's a very mapped out, precision-driven diet. Once your child goes through this and you figure out it's eggs, well, then you don't have eggs anymore. But then that person who is helping you with eliminating eggs from the diet is going to help you find other sources of protein, other sources of choline, and some of those essential nutrients that we find in eggs. We're going to make sure those get replaced with different foods so that your child's not missing out. The Feingold diet is helpful for some kids, but there's not really enough evidence out there to support the usage of it with all kids with ADHD. And that is basically avoiding all foods with additives and dyes. And it can be restrictive in some kids, particularly if kids have a diet full of colorful foods that contain artificial food dyes. When you take all of those out, it can leave children with little to eat. So again, you want to do this with a nutrition professional in conjunction with your healthcare team, and only if you feel that there is good reason to do it. And again, you can take that first step where you just do it on your own at home for a week or two and play around with it, or you can get much more of a deep dive into it by using this Feingold diet. The Few Foods diet is a short-term diet to identify food sensitivities. It's a very restricted diet. That's why it's short-term. In the first phase, only rice, turkey, lamb, vegetables, pears, and water are allowed. And then in phase 2, we add back in potatoes, corn, wheat, and other fruits. This diet is typically used when kids are unresponsive to medications. And it's definitely a diet you want to do with a nutrition professional and your healthcare team. It needs to be done under supervision because it's highly restrictive. And again, any kind of diet that a child goes on, we want to make sure it's a good fit for that child and that the child can grow and develop and function well on it. So the ADHD healthy diet. So what is it? It's a diet that's going to focus on that food balance, 90-10 rule I outlined a little bit earlier. It's going to have a particular eye on fiber, iron, zinc, magnesium, and those healthy fats. It's going to limit additives and sugars and artificial food colors, keeping it in a reasonable place. And it is not going to be heavy in dietary restrictions because that can cause further problems for children with ADHD. And it's going to be anchored in a lot of variety and routine meals and routine snacks day in and day out. The most important thing about what I want you to take away from this is that nutrition is always part of your child's success plan. It should be always part of the treatment plan for children because they are growing and developing every year after year. So that is a very broad sort of introduction to what it means, what is a healthy, good nutritious diet for children with ADHD. You can learn more. I actually have a special course on ADHD nutrition called the ADHD Diet for Kids, where we go even deeper into the food aspect. But we also go into feeding because many parents want to know how to get their kids to eat all of these, nuts and beans and fruits and vegetables and things like that. That's the feeding stuff. And that's the challenge of raising kids sometimes, whether they have ADHD or not. But particularly with ADHD, there's some more common issues with feeding kids. And so that course goes into the nutrition, the food, and the feeding. That's the URL for the course. And you can learn more about it over at my website. And I have a lot more resources as well. If you're trying to get your child to try new foods, I have a book and a workbook on that. And then just some of my general nutrition and feeding resources for parents. So I invite you to come on over. Check out those resources. You can follow me on Facebook, The Nourished Child. I have a podcast called The Nourished Child as well. And I would love to see you there. So thank you so much for your attention. I think I will see if there's any questions.
Yeah, we're going to move on to our Q&A session. And I have posted on the chat the link for the ADHD Diet for Kids, and also Jill's website, so you can have that link available on the chat for you guys. So yeah, we're ready for our Q&A sessions. All right, I think I have someone.
I see one here. It says, what is the best resource for kids with anxiety and that are obese? So I talk a lot about, I'm not sure if you're asking about a resource that I've created, but I do address anxiety in my Try New Food workbook because I talk about sensory sensitivity and some of the there's if you have a picky eater who's extremely picky, and there's a condition out there called ARFID, which we're seeing in more kids with ADHD. We're seeing anxiety, ARFID, and ADHD, kind of a trifecta. And ARFID is an acronym for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. And familiarly, it's just extreme picky eating, oftentimes due to sensory sensitivities and anxiety. So Try New Food, the workbook that I have, does touch on anxiety. And ways to not spark or make, ways to interact with your child around food that does not promote more anxiety, more stress that they can feel at the table. My Eat in Peace workshop also is all about having meals at the table, calm family meals at the table. And it focuses, probably equally on food and nutritious food to offer kids, but just as much on feeding and that interaction. Because I think as parents, we can be, we want our kids to eat a certain way, but our kid is not necessarily doing what we want them to do. And that can get us into a position where we're interacting with our child in a negative way around food. And that is always going to be an interference with good eating. And that then can trickle down to, good growth and development over time. So I would say try new food and Eat in Peace workshop. But I have a lot of free articles over on my website as well, jillcastle.com/blog. Where you can get a lot of information there as well.
We have on our Q&A session, we have a couple of questions from Marcela Diaz. What is GLA?
That is gamma linolenic acid. It's a fatty acid, a healthy fat that you can find in food. It's oftentimes found in nuts, plant oils. So the research that highlights GLA highlights it as a supplement in conjunction with EPA and DHA.
Okay, I have another question from Kizzy. I'm confused. So many parents comment on the benefits of supplements with their kids, yet I'm coming away from this webinar that supplements aren't that effective. Am I missing something?
That's a good question. Supplements are very beneficial if you have a child with a deficient diet. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the research and pull conclusive data from the research, it's very mixed about supplementation. Yet if you look out on the internet and look at the marketing aspect of supplementation, you might easily get the impression that it is absolutely needed. My stance is that, if you have a child who isn't hitting all the high notes on all the food groups, okay, if they're leaving out a food group like vegetables, a micronutrient multivitamin supplement can be useful, can be helpful to fill in the gaps. But in terms of picking out a supplement that is going to cure ADHD, there's no evidence that states that at all anywhere in the research. But can an omega-3 supplement be beneficial? I believe it can be, because I know from practice and experience that there aren't a lot of kids out there that eat a lot of fish every week. They're not eating 2 servings of fish every week. And that's primarily where you're going to get those, DHA and EPA, you're going to get them from fish. And so if that's not in your child's diet regularly, yeah, an omega-3 supplement can be a benefit. The research on iron basically is saying if you don't have a deficiency, it's not really helpful. But if you do have a deficiency, it's very helpful. I had a case once where I had a child that came in with restless leg syndrome, which is a red flag for an iron deficiency. She went and had her blood test done, and she wasn't super low, but she was on the low end of the normal range. And so we started a multivitamin with iron. I didn't go hardcore iron supplementation, but we started a multivitamin with iron with her. And it really bumped up her iron levels, reduced her restless leg syndrome, and helped her sleep better. And that goes back to just knowing the research and understanding where the research is limited and where the research can really help guide you as a clinician. For me, I know the research on early child development very well, and I understand the role of iron in brain development during pregnancy and early infancy. And I also am familiar with the research around iron storage in the brain. And I know that iron storage in the brain doesn't necessarily reflect blood iron status. So, I mean, I think that, yeah, as a parent, as a consumer, it can be really confusing to sort through all the information. That's why I say, work with your team, work with your healthcare provider team. You should not be getting your advice. I shouldn't say this because we're on Facebook, right, Claudia?
Yes.
You shouldn't be getting your advice on Facebook. No. You really want to make sure that what you're doing for your child is medically based, has some scientific evidence behind it, and that is going to keep your child safe. It's going to keep your child safe. And, you know, it's not complicated to do that. But what is important as a parent, I believe, is understanding what good nutrition looks like, what positive feeding means, because our end goal, no matter what, you know, condition you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis with your child, is we want children to enjoy food. We want them to grow well. We want them to feel good and function better. And I think for kids with ADHD, to me, that's the most important thing. That if you think about food and nutrients and nutrition, and you think about the brain, because when we talk about, you know, hyperactivity, impulsivity, lack of attention, that's brain functioning, right? And so we want to make sure that the brain is nourished and getting nutrition. And we know that, you know, eating food every 3 to 4 hours, for example, helps their brains get all those nutrients I just talked about, because they're getting a dose of food and nutrition every 3 to 4 hours. Their brains are getting the glucose it needs to function and think and remember and stay calm. But when kids go from 7 a.m. or 7:30 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they have this huge stretch with no food, it's really, you know, for me as a professional, I think it's really hard for anybody to be expected to pay attention, to engage, to learn, to remember. I know I couldn't if I were not eating anything for 7 or 8 hours. I don't think you function at your best. And so oftentimes parents will say to me, what's the best diet and what's the best supplement and what can I do? And I'm oftentimes guiding parents to getting back to the basics. Let's get 3 meals on board. Let's get the snacks spaced out. Let's make sure that all the food groups are being represented at meal times and a couple at snack times. And let's really get a routine going with food and eating. Let's have a backup plan if your child's at school and won't eat anything all day. Let's figure out with your child what we can do to make sure there's something going into their body in the middle of the day, so we don't have this 8-hour stretch with nothing. So those basic things, to me, are far more important than figuring out whether a mega dose of vitamins are going to be the best thing that I could do for my child right now.
Marcella is asking, I have a son with ADHD and is taking growth hormone therapy. Would ADHD meds not be beneficial for him?
I think that's something you need to talk with your doctor about. If your son's on growth hormone therapy, then he's deficient in growth hormone and he needs that. What I've seen in terms of medications is that certain medications are tied to a delay in linear growth or in height. But once those medications, and there are some strategies you can use with, you know, time off on the weekends versus time on during the week. That's all something to map out with your pediatrician, but that's a very good question. And I would go back to your healthcare team and have a conversation about that.
Then I have another question from M. Kissy. What multivitamin would be recommended to start with? Or is this a question for our team doctors?
Well, your team doctors might have a preference for what micronutrient supplements that they would like to use. I have a list of multivitamins that I like. I don't tend to go with like the Flintstones variety for ADHD because of the artificial food colors. So I like to go with supplements that tend to be, no additives, no preservatives, no colors in them. And I am blanking right now. It's almost 10. It is 10 o'clock at night. I am blanking on the brand names right now. I'm really sorry about that. But when you think about it, I know it's going to come to me here in a minute, but there's a few. I have a list actually of vitamin and mineral supplements that I like for kids with ADHD. I can post a couple of those brands on the Facebook page, Claudia, or get them to you that you can share.
We can share that on our Facebook, or you can always send us an email, or we'll make sure we post that on Facebook.
Okay.
And then I think we're gonna take this last question from Angela. My 5-year-old loves sugar treats. We do not have candy in the house, but when the holiday treats are around, he's crazy for it. Can you be addicted to sugar, or is it just that it's there and he thinks he wants it or needs it?
I'm suspecting that most 5-year-olds love sugary treats too, and candy, especially around the holidays. But there's this thing called scarcity, food scarcity, and it often happens with sugary sweet treats. And if your child never sees them and then all of a sudden they're around, he might be responding to the fact that they're around, and they're not usually. No, there's no evidence that kids can be addicted to sugar. When we look at children's behavior around sugar, it's either what I described earlier, that aggressiveness and that hyperactivity that can come from the high spikes in blood sugar and then the drop, the plummet, the valley. That there's a change in epinephrine, which can cause hyperactivity. With kids who are responding hyperactively after they eat, do the experiment, take it away for a week and see. But when you don't ever have sweets and treats in the house, when they're 0% of the diet, remember that icon I showed you, 90% nourishing foods, 10% fun foods. When sweets and treats are 0%, they're restricted. Children see them as forbidden or restricted, and they can overreact to them when they're around. And we have research that shows that they overreact by eating too much of it and changing their behavior, becoming very excitable. So it's hard to tease out. I think that, if you never have it around and then you see a significant change in your son's behavior when it is around, I would say bring it around a little bit more and try to make it part of your normal, not everyday eating, but like, don't make them so taboo. Like, make sure that, maybe Fridays he gets a piece of candy with his snack in the afternoon or something, that it's something he can expect and be predictable, and it's more normalized and neutralized in the diet, as opposed to something that's so scarce that he needs to, almost binge on it and hoard it when it is around. Claudia, I also see one question here about low iron stores. After a sleep study showed he had over 40 leg movements an hour, and he should have been having 5 blood work and ferrous sulfate for a couple of years. Yeah, so that's just somebody who is showing that, iron is tied to restless leg syndrome, and it goes away when iron is repleted.
Yeah. With this, we close our Q&A sessions, and this has been an awesome presentation. I think this is full and rich of resources that not just kids with ADHD, but I think for every kid and for us as adults, it's very important to understand, that we get everything from our food. And it's just being mindful of what we eat and how we eat it. So thank you so much for this. We really appreciate it. And everyone, we will have the replays on Facebook, on our website. Please check out the course and Jill's website, thenourishchild.com, and our website, ADHDonline.com. I think we have one more question that we can answer. Oh, thank you, Jill. You were great.
Oh,
Yes, you are.
thank
And-
you.
And you are all great. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We appreciate that. And stay tuned. We're having lots of wonderful resources for you. And we appreciate Jill for being here with us tonight. Thank you so much. And Merry Christmas to everyone. And thank you so much again, Jill.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.